Today we're going to talk about Chapter 5, which is the classical style. Again, we're still dealing with Greece, and we're in the period of from 700 to 30 BCE. Now, if one thing can be noted about ancient Greece, or the classical Greece, is the shift that took place where we went from less organized, less straight lines and perfect symmetry to this shift in style that could be understood with more order and more proportion. And two very notable thinkers of this time that helped aid in this shift are Pythagoras and Vitruvius. Pythagoras being into music, art, math, a whole range of humanistic contributions, and then Vitruvius attributed to architecture. Pythagoras, he had observed music and discovered that music was actually governed by mathematical ratios, and therefore it constituted both a science and an art. And there's a story that's recorded that explains how he had this revelation, how he got this epiphany. But the story goes, Pythagoras was one day passing by a blacksmith shop, and as he passed by, he heard the clanging of the hammers and the sounds of the metal being pounded out. And he has this epiphany. And it was supposedly at this moment that he discovered a correlation between the sounding intervals and their numerical ration. So Pythagoras equated musical ratios with the unchanging cosmic order. As he believed, and many believed at the time, music had this sort of this power, almost magical, and that it could almost put you in tune with the universe. And so even to understand this musical kind of magic, we can see this some in the Old Testament where I think one of the prophets is either Elijah or Elisha, I can't remember exactly, goes to prophesy and says, "Bring me a musician." And so there was sort of this idea that music accompanies prophecy, and in many ways you could still see a manifestation of that today. You know, when you go to church, there's music, or at the end of the service they may be playing music softly, or if you were to visit listen to the imams who quote, lead the prayers in Islam, and it's very musical. And so you see this, it's kind of shot through all religion and kind of magical belief systems that music has this power. But he also believed that the planets orbiting around the Earth could also be understood by a theory called the harmony of spheres. And so even music and his concept of the way he saw the world, that everything was in harmony. Of course, you could, if you know the way history goes, we pretty much killed the idea that anything in our solar system, well, our planetary system, revolved around the Earth. The heliocentric model, which is the true model, which we learned from Copernicus, and that the Earth is, in fact, not at the center of the universe. And so he called that the harmony of spheres. But the harmony aspect is what pays homage here to order and proportion. And Vitruvius, he was an architect, and he wrote a book called De Architectura. And it's the only major work on the architecture of classical antiquity to have survived. So there's a great significance attached to it. We can observe a lot of these remaining structures today. If you ever go to the ancient ruins that are in Greece and throughout that part of Europe, you can observe a lot of this architecture. But with his De Architectura, we are able to see the thinking behind it, the actual architectural styles written down. So it's pretty interesting. But Vitruvius, what really is significant is he identified that there are certain orders in architecture. and he laid down some strict rules of proportion, symmetry, and detail for each order. So we actually can look back at that time period. We can observe things from the Ionic order, the Doric order, and the Corinthian order. And those were also identified. They were called these things because of where they were used in the world, but also we're able to know that just because where it came from and what it was called, there were certain rules that had to follow, which is how we identify it. So there was order in music, there was order in architecture, and also in this time period, everything was very humanist. And, we have a concept today of humanism, and a lot of times associated with atheists, or, I'm a humanist, and ethical humanism and things like that. But in this sense, humanism really dealt with just the product of humanity, of humankind, the contributions that man was making. And so really, at the core of why we call a course like this the Humanities, or the Introduction to the Humanities, is because we're looking at the contribution that humanity had in the existence of the world, and we're studying the meaning and the value of those things. And so humanism refers to those qualities that derive from the human physique and human actions. So a lot of attention is drawn to the human form, as you probably noticed in the text with all the naked statues from this time period. But humanism refers not only to the human form, but also the human mind. So classical Greece was a period which saw the beginning of education as we know it. The beginning of the study of history, philosophy, drama, grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, and astronomy. It was a period that strove for excellence and perfection, for absolutes of knowledge, and for the truth found in knowledge. Humanism in this time was a this worldly belief in the dignity and inherent worth of beings. Now, coming out of this humanistic contribution of art and poetry and literature and all these things, we had, especially in artwork, two concepts that were very distinct. And one is realism, one is idealism. Now, realism is described as a faithfulness to nature. It's an accurate reproduction of something. So you look at a tree, you carve a tree out of stone, and it looks just exactly like the tree. Or you paint a picture of a rock, and it looks just like the rock that you're using. Or you paint a picture of a person, and so you put in everything that deals with that actual person. And if they're fat, you paint them fat. You don't embellish. You don't change it. And so that would be realism. Things look like the real things that they're expressions of. So modern art would be sort of an abandonment of realism. And so you could have a dirty shoe on top of a bottom of a trash can that's turned over and say, this is a tree. Okay, well, not really. Maybe in your impression of a tree or some sense of, in an abstract sense, but that's not realism. But the classical style also refines nature, and what we call that refining of nature is idealism. And so the ideal is not just like a human sculpture would be like the person you are sculpting, but you would actually sculpt the ideal person, extremely fit, the perfect form of a human. When you see all these naked statues in this chapter, for the most part, they were all physically fit. They were all, healthy, and, they all had soft features. None of them were ugly. And so there was this ideal type that was being expressed in a lot of the sculptures and the artwork. And the reason they would show them naked would honestly be because they could show all the form that way. And so not only did it show off the artistic ability of the artist or the sculptor, but it did not leave any mystery to how that person or that ideal form should be, which is interesting. The main thrust in Greek idealism is directed towards showing that the ordinary everyday items themselves cannot be understood just by themselves, that they can only be understood in terms of something else over and beyond. So one cannot know what is considered ugly unless there is some idealistic concept of beauty that exists in the mind. So this was represented in the way these art forms were supposed to be perfect forms, perfect ideal forms. In a philosophical sense, this view holds that the only reality in the world that's real is the ideal. And Plato was actually an exponent of this view. And he believed that the physical world around us isn't real. It's constantly changing, and thus you can never really say what it really is. There is a world of ideas, however, which is a world of unchanging and absolute truth. And so whatever that absolute truth, idealistic form is, that's reality, and then everything else isn't. This is not too different than Carl Jung and his concept dealing with archetypes, and that every ideal archetype is this archaic form that exists somewhere in your collective conscience, which is a little bit of a stretch and quite a ways into the future from this time period. But in our artistic sense, and this is really what we're getting at, idealism is the commitment to an underlying standard of perfection, also known as the ideal. So the way that the classical style came about is that it evolved from an ancient, more what we'll call the archaic, which was based on Egyptian and Near Eastern monumental art. And over the centuries, Greek sculpture evolved into this uniquely Greek vision of the art form. Greek artists would reach a peak of artistic excellence, which captured the human form in a way never before seen, and which was much copied. So Greek sculptors were particularly concerned with proportion, again this comes up, poise, and the idealized perfection of the human body. And their figures in stone and bronze have become some of the most recognizable pieces of art ever produced by any civilization. So from the 8th century, we have this archaic Greece. And in that time it was the solid figures of clay, ivory, bronze. There was probably some wood, no doubt, used, but wood does not preserve well, so we don't have a whole lot of specimen, if any, that I can think of. And there were bronze figures as well. Human heads were common in the archaic. Griffins were used as attachment to bronze vessels, such as cauldrons. In style, the human figures in the archaic resemble those in contemporary geometric pottery designs, having elongated limbs and triangular torsos. Animal figures, especially horses, were common. And many have been found from this archaic period across Greek at sanctuary sites, like places in Olympia and Delphi, indicating their common function as votive offerings. And if the elongated limbs and the torso, that's not quite anything like what we see in these statues. And so that was very archaic, and that would not be realism, because people do not have elongated limbs and triangular torsos, and they're not walking around on their tippy toes the way we see in some of these paintings on pottery. So in that archaic period, it was very, very different than where we end up in the classical period. Because in the classical period, the Greek sculptors, they break out of convention and they achieve what no one else had ever really even attempted before. They created life-size and lifelike sculptures that glorified the human, and especially, again, the nude male form. Even more was achieved than this, though. Marble turned out to be a wonderful medium for rendering what all sculptors strive for. That is, to make the piece seem carved from the inside rather than chiseled from the outside. And so the figures they were able to carve out of marble were, more sensuous, frozen in action. They had this like real facial expressions. Their clothes could be blowing in the wind or clinging to their body because they're wet. I mean, just any possible concept that you could imagine in reality, again, realism, you could display in these carved marble sculptures. So quite simply, the sculptures no longer seemed to be sculptures, but they were like real life figures, instilled with life and vitality and expression and emotion, which was unlike anything that had ever been done before. So the Greeks created amazing artwork, and they likewise created phenomenal architecture that was just shot through with this amazing artwork. And one of the most significant of these is the Parthenon. The Parthenon is one of the most notable Greek architectural structures that we know of. It was built to honor the god Athena, from the Greek word parthenos, which means virgin or maiden, which were common ideas associated with Athena, not too uncommon. Typically goddesses, even we could argue the Mother Mary, are considered to be sort of eternally virgin, eternally maiden types. But the Parthenon was used building a post and lintel system. And this is just a simple method of constructing which involves the use of vertical and horizontal elements. And so you've got your posts, which run vertical, and then you have your horizontal lintel across the top, same way you would build a door frame today. You have your posts, then you put your header in across the top, which is horizontal. The verticals support the horizontals, creating one story of a building, but you could also build on top of it. And this is a way of building that was incredibly important to the architecture of ancient Greece. Its ease and utility made it a popular choice, even when other methods of construction had been developed. So the Parthenon was a large temple. It's not the largest one in Greece, but its aesthetic appeal is what makes it so amazing. The Parthenon basically epitomizes all the ideals of Greek thought. And so the idealism of the Greek way of thinking, the attention to detail, as well as the understanding of mathematically explained harmony in the natural world, were concepts that, in every Athenian's eyes, set them apart from the barbarians. And so if you were to see the Parthenon, if anybody in the world was to see the Parthenon and know that this was a product of the Greek intellect, the Athenian ability and mind, and humanistic effort, there would be something in that would say, wow, these people are set apart. And so the Athenians and the Greeks would call anyone who didn't speak Greek a barbarian. And so we use that word today, just to refer to somebody as, vulgar or aggressive, and the person's a barbarian. But the reason they called them that was because to them, they thought anybody who didn't speak Greek sounded like they were saying, going bar, 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 bar. So they were making fun of them. And so if you didn't speak Greek, which was an eloquent, style of language, everyone who didn't speak Greek in the eyes of the Greeks were barbarians because they sounded like they were barking like dogs, basically. And so this whole concept of how they were set apart and what made them so amazing and artistic was embodied in the Parthenon. And in their minds, it's what set them apart from everyone else. On the Parthenon, there were sculptures called pediments. And pediments are the triangular ends of the gable ends of the Greek temple. And so you have your long, the temple was more rectangular, it wasn't square, and so you had long pillars across, the long ends, and then on the ends it would have the triangular gable at the top. You can kind of imagine this, and then in those were carved, pediments. And the subject of each pediment, the subject of the east pediment was Athena's birth, and the west pediment the struggle for Attica between Athena and Poseidon, and just below the pediments were metopes belonging to a Doric frieze along the outside of the temple above the architrave. Now, a frieze is just a horizontal area that could be carved into. And so inside the Parthenon, there was actually a sculpture called the Inner Ionic Frieze. Inner because it's inside. Ionic, going back to the orders we discussed a little bit a minute ago. It belonged to the Ionic order. And a frieze because it was in that horizontal section. And in that Ionic frieze, it was this interesting Pan-Athenaic festival procession. And you're probably like, what is that, right? And the Pan-Athenaic festival took place every 4 years in Athens. The procession would begin at the Dipylon Gate to the city and then ended on the Acropolis, where the Athenians placed a new peplos, which is a robe, on the ancient wooden statue of Athena. So on the Parthenon frieze, this procession begins on the west, that is the temple's rear, the side facing the gateway to the Acropolis, and then it proceeds in parallel lines down the long north and south sides of the building and ends at the center of the east frieze. It's interesting because scholars find it fascinating that there is an Ionic frieze inside of a Doric temple. Because again, these styles were found in different geographic regions and from different epochs, different time periods. And so we find kind of a mixture here. And there is some scholarly debate around that. So the Greek orders, just to give you a clarity one more time, are derived from the Greek regions where they were most commonly employed. So we have the Doric, which formulated on the mainland and remained the preferred manner there and in Greece's western colonies. Now the Ionic order was the choice of the Aegean Islands and on the western coast of Asia Minor. The latest of the Greek orders is that of the Corinthian order, which of course was common in Corinth. So architecture, art. Now let's talk a little bit about poetry. In this time, we had some pretty amazing contributions to poetry. The classical style of poetry, two names that we're going to talk about here are Sappho and Pindar, in the Greek Pindaros. But Sappho was from the island of Lesbos. Even during the classical period, her work, which is pretty cool, this is a woman, rather, and even during the classical period, her work was highly regarded. Plato referred to her as the 10th muse, and we know of about 6 plays that take her as the subject. Her life and work were lampooned by playwrights and condemned morally corrupt by later Christian writers. In 1073, Pope Gregory VII called for the public burning of her poetry in both Rome and Constantinople. It was not until the Renaissance that Sappho and her work were once again valued and studied. The age of Greek lyric poetry began in the age of orality in ancient Greece in the 7th century and continued through the 5th century BCE. The merging of the music of the lyre with the words of the poet resulted in a powerful rhetorical form that scholars are still examining. Sappho is the most prominent of the Greek lyricists, and because her work stands on par with that of Homer, her significance in the history of rhetoric would be hard to overstate. And then there's Pindar. Pindar wrote odes and also what we would call paeans. And odes and paeans are kind of the same, but they're basically songs of triumph or any solemn song or chant. The most celebrated examples of this genre is, in fact, Pindar. Now, these became known to 20th century scholars because they actually came across some papyrus fragments, which gave us more insight into Pindar's odes. But if you look on page 128 in your text, there are some readings there from Pindar's odes. We've got Nemean Ode 6 and Pythian Ode 8. So, music, architecture, and poetry. Let's not neglect thought. A little bit of Hellenistic philosophy. Hellenistic schools of thought that are noteworthy would be the skeptics, the cynics, the Epicureans, and the Stoics. Now, the skeptics are interesting. The ancient skeptics argued that if we cannot confidently claim knowledge, we should hold back from any kind of truth claim, which is interesting because if you study the postmodern movement, there is this belief that it's like, what can we know? We can't know anything. And, we don't trust anything you've ever learned, and there is no absolute truth. But it's interesting because in order to say there is no absolute truth, that statement, in order to be true, would have to be absolutely true. So it's kind of a self-defeating concept to say there is no absolute truth. My question to that statement is that absolutely true? So you can see the circular thinking. But the skeptic said that, if we can't confidently claim any knowledge, then we shouldn't even attempt to have any kind of truth claim. We should hold back from belief, not just knowledge claims. So Hellenistic skepticism was initiated by Pyrrho of Elis, who may have accompanied Alexander the Great on his march to India. And the skeptics looked back questioningly to such past systems as the dialectics, which we talked about in the last lecture, and the theory of the sense of perception, relativism of the sophists, and the Cyrenaic epistemology. And so they looked at everything and said, we can't know any of this. And so, today we use that word skeptic and say, that person is very skeptical, or, I'm a little skeptical of this. It means you don't trust it, you don't believe it, you question it, you doubt it. And then we have the Cynics, which was a classical Greek philosophical school characterized by asceticism, which is self-denial. We had ascetic monks in Christianity who isolated themselves, lived in the forest, and all they did was pray and sometimes brew beer. It's a little bit of a joke, but it's true. So the ascetic lifestyle would be that self-denial. And so the Cynics were ascetic, and they put emphasis on the sufficiency of virtue for happiness, boldness in speech, and they were shameless in their actions. The Cynics were strongly influenced by Socrates and were themselves important influence on Stoic ethics, which we'll talk about Stoics here in a second. So again, if someone says you're very cynical, it's where we get that word. And then we have the Epicureans, who were like the Stoics, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the Epicureans were materialists. And they added the concept of empty space and were atomists. And if you remember, we talked about atomism a little bit, just in passing before. And these are very deep philosophical concepts that you would have to take an entire class on philosophy to really get into some of the depth behind these schools of thought. But, the Epicureans rejected determinism. They advocated hedonism, which is the belief that happiness, is the ultimate good. But they were it was a very restrained kind of hedonism, which is interesting in itself. Their hedonism was largely a matter of emphasizing the role of feeling, but they did put stress on the pains that follow excess. Just to give you an example, today if you say someone is an Epicurean, it means that they're into food, and so there's a pleasure in eating food, but the Epicureans would say, well, you don't want to gorge yourself. So wine is good because it tastes good, it makes you feel good, but too much wine would be detrimental. It would cause a hangover, or you could die or whatever. So skeptics, cynics, Epicureans, and then the Stoics finally. Now, the Stoics were very deterministic in their views. They believe that what happens. There's consequences. If you do something, then it could cause something else to happen. So everything happens for a reason. They held this deterministic views, and they advocated the acceptance of fate. And based on a self-sufficiency, they had a realization that virtue was the ultimate value. Stoic comes from the Greek word for porch, as that names the area where they used to meet. Stoicism became a broad movement defined by these adherents' allegiance to reason, the subordination of passion to reason, and they also had a conviction and a belief in a single good God or divine being, and they believed in natural law. But Stoic is the most important thing that we seem to carry forward from the Stoic philosophy was that subordination of your feelings and your emotions. And so if someone is accused of being very stoic, it means they don't show any emotion. And so grieving, you wouldn't be a stoic would be philosophically opposed to outbursts of emotion, grief, and things like that. And so in the Hellenistic philosophy, we have skeptics, cynics, Epicureans, and we have Stoics. Now, we cannot ignore, of course, the influence of these Hellenistic schools of thought. In fact, we see them mentioned even in Christianity. If you look in the book of Acts, in chapter 17, there's Paul is in Athens, and he goes and preaches in the Areopagus, and it says there that he actually was speaking to the Stoics and the Epicureans. And so when he goes and stands even in the Areopagus and he preaches this sermon that, these times of ignorance God's overlooked, but now calls all to repentance, he actually quotes the Stoic poet Aratus. So that's just kind of an interesting little side note there. But we can't forget about the artwork that was attributed to the gods. Again, and just like in the Olympic Games, everything was done unto the gods. There was no real separation of, artistic expression and humanistic ability apart from this gift we have as humans to create, and we give to the gods. And so we see this in Hellenistic art. Again, the altar of Zeus being one of these great examples. The altar of Zeus, and actually of Athena, was at a place called Pergamon. And it's one of the most important monuments of the Hellenistic period. The setting for the altar is the high urbanized citadel of the Attalid kings in Pergamon, which is in Asia Minor, and imposing outcropping in a dramatic, scenic setting. The buildings on the citadel form a civic religious acropolis of enormous grandeur, about 800 feet above the actual city below. The palace of the kings was at the apex, surrounded by a complex of religious buildings that stepped down in plains to the lower city. Once again, the difference between classical restraint and Hellenistic drama becomes clear. And then we have the Apollo Belvedere. or maybe a Belvedere. I bet it's Belvedere. The reason why I think it might be is because that is actually a corner in the Vatican, like a wing somewhere in one of the Vatican museums where this piece of art is stored. So it's probably Italian, so we'll say Belvedere. But I don't speak Italian. Greek, I got a little bit. I've studied Greek for years, but not so much Italian or Latin, really. The Apollo Belvedere is named after its display location in the wing of the Vatican. It's actually a copy. The form that we have now surfaced in the 1500s. And it's actually famous all over Europe. And being a copy of the original, Apollo's pose was widely copied because it was a model of stylistic perfection. So we kind of see this later copying of this Hellenistic style because they copied it because it was that good. And so if you were to try to reproduce a piece of artwork, you would copy this style that was the perfect, ideal almost. You would try to mimic that, and if you could, of course, you'd be doing well as an artist. And so by the end of the 15th century, this Apollo Belvedere was in the private garden of Fiuliano della Rovere, who would later become Pope Julius II. The figure is identified, of course, as Apollo, and he may be shooting a bow and arrow, but it's damaged, so we don't really know. And you can see a picture of this sculpture in your text on page 131, figure 5.31. Next we have the Nike of Samothrace, which originally stood in the marble bow of a sculpted warship, a monument that commemorated a naval victory. Now, the Nike is designed to seem as if she is just landing in a fierce headwind, coming kind of out of the sky, landing, and her great wings are still aloft, and the body twists slightly as if to maintain its balance, while her clothes are heavy with the sea spray, both clings and billows dramatically. This monument was erected in a grotto on a hill overlooking the sanctuary of the great gods on the northern Aegean island of Samothrace. A reflecting pool created the illusion that the warship was sailing out of its rectangular base, while a misting fountain simulated sea spray. So it was a very dramatic piece of artwork. It was made of marble, and the Nike is an excellent example of the expressive Hellenistic style. The lively drapery, twisting pose, and dramatic setting create a dynamic composition that is much in common with the art of Pergamon. Although the Nike's arms and head are missing, they did discover a hand in 1950 to that statue that clearly shows that the goddess was not holding a victory wreath. And you might be like, what do you mean, not holding a victory wreath? Well, typically we see this statue, and all over the world, we have these plazas and squares, and on them we have this victory statue, Nike, and she's holding a wreath. And a lot of times these are war memorials, monuments dedicated to the ending of World War I. And you can see them. I think there's one in Minsk, Belarus, some around in Germany, other places. But it's interesting because the statue that they found that is sort of the model, the most earliest form of this, she's not actually holding a wreath, so that's funny. And then we have Laocoon and his sons. And one of the amazing discoveries of the Italian Renaissance was that they had found this sculpture of Laocoon and his sons, which is a depiction of an event in Virgil's Aeneid, which is in Book 2. The Trojan priest Laocoon was strangled by sea snakes sent by the gods who favored the Greeks while he was sacrificing at the altar of Neptune. Because Laocoon had tried to warn the Trojan citizens of the danger of bringing in the wooden Trojan horse, he incurred the wrath of the gods.